Okay, in chapter 11, we're going to talk about meiosis and what we know as sexual reproduction. So let's talk about the two different types of reproduction here in section 1. The two different types are sexual and asexual. So, first off, you should know a couple things about reproduction. One, to reproduce is to make an offspring. In sexual reproduction, you'll have two parents. Half of the genetic information that you have as an offspring will come from your mom and the other half from your dad. In asexual reproduction, however, you are genetically identical to one parent because you only have one parent, and you are known as a daughter cell. The reason they're called daughter cells as offspring for asexual reproduction is because mothers carry the offspring, and so they consider anything that has birth to be a female. And so in asexual reproduction, just because they're called daughter cells, it's because they term mothers have babies. That's where that comes from. There really is no gender, though, with asexual reproduction. You can't go to a bacteria and say, oh, they're all female. That's not really how it works. But you will hear it referred to as daughter cells that are produced, and that's simply just stating that we have two genetically identical offspring. There is really no sex to those. Okay, anyway, so with asexual reproduction, the offspring will look exactly like the parent. In sexual reproduction, we have some genetic variation. That genetic variation is because you have traits from both your parent, your mom, and your dad. And so the dominant traits will be exposed. Maybe some recessive traits that neither one of your parents have will be exposed. And so in sexual reproduction, the offspring does not have to look like the parents, or could look like more dominantly one parent than the other. But in asexual reproduction, it will be an exact genetic replica and look identical to the parent in which it came from. So let's talk about asexual reproduction right now. So asexual reproduction, you only need one parent. So there is some advantages, should we say, to asexual reproduction. Because you only need one parent for asexual reproduction, you can reproduce easily. You don't have to look for a mate. However, some species will actually go through asexual reproduction when the conditions for the environment are ideal. It means it's easy. But when the environment itself starts to change, the organism must be able to adapt. If they can't adapt, it won't live. And asexual reproduction does not allow for genetic variation, and so there isn't adaptations that will occur unless a huge mutation happens. This is where some animals who will asexually reproduce most of their life will find a partner and sexually reproduce. So we do have some species like fungus that are able to do both. And when the environmental conditions become harsh, they'll actually seek out a mate so that their offspring have more genetic variation and will have a better chance to survive. Anyway, we have 4 types of asexual reproduction: binary fission, fragmentation, budding, and parthenogenesis. And so we're going to talk about all 4 of these types, and you guys tomorrow are going to start doing an activity with them. So let's talk about binary fission. So what you see is a huge, long, drawn-out process for binary fission. Binary fission is simply mitosis. What? No, yes, it truly is mitosis. And so you can see we start with one cell. It goes into interphase, and it spends most of its time getting larger, duplicating those chromosomes. It goes through that S phase or synthesis phase. It's going through its G1 and G2, and then it will go completely through mitosis. And when it goes through mitosis, it will actually split and separate and form 2 cells called daughter cells. These daughter cells are genetically identical to one another. Bacteria like to go through binary fission. And so when we see this, you'll see that when this occurs, the DNA strands are copied. They are divided equally between the 2 cells, and they are completely the same size at the end. And so the 2 daughter cells that are formed at the very end of this are genetically identical to the first prokaryote that started. This happens typically in prokaryotic organisms. Bacteria would be the most common, protists is another one. Binary fission is very simple, and it is simply mitosis. And so you have the exact same number of chromosomes as you did before, or you have the exact same number of DNA strands or plasmids as you started with originally. So that's binary fission. The next one is fragmentation. And the reason there's a picture of a starfish here is because you see fragmentation occur a lot in starfish. And so basically in fragmentation, this happens in multicellular eukaryotes, and it's also partially a defense mechanism. And so you will see that in fragmentation, a fragment of the body will actually break off. That fragment of the body will regrow to form a new adult. And so sometimes you'll see starfish in one of their little, appendages will be much, much larger than the other 4 or other 3 or other 2. And the reason that is because the larger one is actually much older. It was actually broken off, and the rest of the body regrew from that. Now, don't think that you can take a starfish and cut it up into 1 billion pieces, and then all those little pieces are going to grow new starfish. It's not like that. You actually have to have a very large segment for that to happen. And you don't see animals like chameleons, which they'll lose their tail, or some lizards will actually, their tails will fall off. So that's a defense mechanism for them, for predators. That doesn't mean the tail that fell off is going to grow a new iguana. It's not going to happen. There's not going to be a new lizard from that tail. It typically only happens in sea organisms like starfish, who can also reproduce sexually, by the way. Then we have budding. Budding is also a form of mitosis. And so with budding, though, different from binary fission, budding, you will see that you have these little kind of like pimple-like appendages or smaller bumps form onto the parent cell, and they're actually going to bud and form a smaller version of that cell. And so with this, you can see right here, this portion is going to form a new yeast cell, because this is yeast. This will form a new little yeast cell, but it will be much smaller than the original. And so this is an example of where this one's much smaller than the original from that. We also see budding occur in plants. And so with that, you'll see grass will have runners, and they'll actually have a root system, and you'll see buds form of new grass. Blades will come up in different areas, and that's pretty common with grasses. And so we also see it with a lot of weeds as well. Then we have parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is kind of cool because it's actually the fertilization of an egg without being fertilized by a male. And so you can see the first part up here. This is regular fertilization. This is sexual reproduction up here. However, down here is parthenogenesis, where we have this embryonic information being put in, and we have fertilization occur. However, there was no sperm. Parthenogenesis is really cool because it is the actual fertilization of an egg without a male being present. And scientists have studied this phenomenon, because it doesn't happen very often, to understand cloning. And because we've gone through that, it's able to make parthenogenesis an actual tool that we've used to actually be able to clone. Because what we do with cloning is we take genetic information and put it into an egg. And if it wasn't for understanding parthenogenesis, we probably wouldn't understand how to clone an organism either. And so that becomes super important for those. Then we're going to talk a little bit about sexual reproduction. Okay, most eukaryotic organisms, aka you, will go through sexual reproduction. You have two parents with genetic information, and the offspring is genetically different from their parents. It's because our offspring, they hold a combination of half your alleles from your mom and half your alleles from your dad. We'll talk about alleles next chapter, really. But anyway, the offspring are completely different from the parents. And so you'll see sometimes parents will have kids that don't look anything like them, but they might look like exactly like an aunt or an uncle, and that's not really uncommon. Sometimes your parents will have traits, which we call recessive, that aren't expressed. And those traits, if there's 2 recessive traits, will be expressed in the offspring. And so sometimes you'll have offspring that will have different characteristics than the original parent. Each parent gives a reproductive cell called a gamete. In males, that gamete is sperm. In females, that gamete is an egg. When the sperm comes in contact with an egg and fertilizes it, it makes what we call a zygote. And a zygote will then develop into what we know as an embryo. An embryo will then develop into a fetus into an infant or baby. And so we have to go through this process called fertilization. If fertilization does not occur, then a zygote will not form. So what are some advantages? First off, germ cells, which we know as sex cells, are your sperm and egg. And so each parent will have one type of germ cell. However, your body has another type of cell called a somatic cell. These somatic cells are what we use to use for cloning, and also can be used for parthenogenesis. But the somatic cells are like your liver cells, your skin cells. These are all your other cells in your body. And so sexual reproduction has a lot of advantages. 1, genetic diversity. You have a population that is now changing. That's a good thing. Who wants to be exactly like their parents, exact clone of them? It's an easier and more effective way of reproduction because you have more viable offspring or more offspring that will live, and you have some diversity. This allows for surviving changes in the environment. Now, chromosomes. So when we start talking about chromosomes, we're going to do that in the next set of videos because we're running out of time on this one. So pick up with the next one.